In this video, I'm going to talk about Nicholas II and Nicholas II from 1906 to 1916. This is the second in the series of videos looking at the reign of Nicholas II and leads directly on from the last one, which covered his early reign. Nicholas II is the third Tsar that we're going to look at in this course, and he rules from 1894 to 1917. And because his reign is so long, I've decided to split his reign into different videos. In the last video, I looked at 1894 to 1906, and in this video, I'd like to look at 1906 to 1916, and in the next one, I'll just look at 1917 alone. Now, let's begin where the last video ended. And the last video ended at the end of 1905 with the revolution coming to an end and Nicholas promising in the October Manifesto the creation of a State Duma. And that State Duma or Parliament really starts now appearing in this second bit of his reign. And this is a picture of the Duma meeting, as you can see here. In this bit of his reign, from 1906 to 1916, there are 4 separate parliaments. Let's look at each one separately. The first Duma that ran from May until July of 1906, so only really for a couple of months, was not successful. The Bolsheviks and the SRs were completely boycotted the whole thing because they didn't want to be a part of that democratic process because they thought it was really rigged by Nicholas. Despite the fact that the Bolsheviks and the SRs boycott it, it's incredibly radical and Nicholas dismisses it very quickly. So again, you can see that idea of Nicholas really still holding the reins of political authority. The second Duma lasts a tiny amount longer and really reigns from February to June of 1907. And arguably it's still also not very successful. The Bolsheviks and the SRs decide actually they want to join in, and as a result of them joining in, it's heavily left-wing majority, and the Duma refuses to work with Stolypin, who is the premier, and it again gets dissolved. Now it's at this point that Nicholas decides actually the Duma is clearly not working and not doing what he wants. So he changes the franchise, the voting franchise. He basically changes the franchise to people who've got more money and more land. He disenfranchises poorer people and in doing so ensures that the Duma is going to be more conservative. So the third Duma, which actually lasts its full reign from 1907 to 1912, is actually really quite successful. They agree vast amounts of legislation, so there is 2,500 pieces of legislation that is proposed during this period, and 2,200 of those are passed, and many of them involving the agricultural reforms we'll come to in the next bit. But really importantly, that third Duma leaves out a significant amount of the population. So this is not a full democracy in any shape of the form. Nicholas has still got his authority. And that's really emphasised in the fourth Duma. And the fourth Duma runs from 1912 to 1916. And it declines in terms of its influence because Nicholas is basically crawling and clawing back more power as he does so. So is there modern democracy, modern politics? No. Arguably, Nicholas is still really an authoritarian ruler ruling over Russia. Let's look at the economy now. So post-1905 revolution, the economy actually booms, and it's one of the successes of this period, and it booms both industrially and agriculturally. Overall, the economy grows at 8% per year from 1894 to 1913, and those figures are huge, massive figures, showing that Russia's economy is booming at this time. And great evidence of that is the fact that railway trackage doubles during this period. So you've got this massive boom in railways. The Trans-Siberian Railway, which has opened up just before this, now leads to this surge of railway across Russia. In addition to that, factories grow. And really importantly, big cities start to grow as a result of those factories being there. This is a picture of the Putilov Works in St. Petersburg. And by 1908, there are 40,000 factories and coal and oil production is booming. Industrially, things are definitely taking off. it is nowhere near yet a modern economy. It's nowhere near yet, arguably, caught up with Western Europe and other great powers at the time, but it is growing rapidly. Agriculture also now finally gets a jolt and also starts to boom, thanks to this man here, Peter Stolypin. And Stolypin really leads the charge to improve agriculture. He realises quite cleverly and quite sensibly that if Russia needs to become stable, Russia needs a happy peasantry. So he puts through a series of policies to really aim at improving the peasant's life. Obviously, reparations have been got rid of at the end of the 1905 revolution, and these are the next steps. So Stolypin puts through a massive series of legislation. These are the highlights. Peasants are now given the right to leave their commune for the first time. Collective ownership of land is abolished because they realise that there are too many people who own too small bits of land to make it sustainable. That's got rid of. New peasant banks are set up, so loans are really easily available. And the Mir, the local council, which had really been stifling new growth and initiative, is got rid of. And those actions do lead to improvements. Russia becomes the largest producer of cereal by 1909, but there are limitations. And by 1914, 90% of farms were still strip farms. That's not productive, that's not efficient. Arguably, the war is the thing that stopped Stolypin being as successful as he was. But Stolypin's reforms, which he puts through in that early period, really do lead to some improvements, despite the fact that he is assassinated later on. But that economic boom, I don't want you to think that economic boom means that society is thriving. It's not. And life for the Russian people continues to be extremely hard during this period. There is a massive population growth, a population explosion, you could arguably say. And lots of that population was growing in cities. There is a huge move at this time of urbanisation. People moving from the countryside, freed by Stolypin's new laws, moved to the towns and the cities, looking for jobs in those new factories. And although there are new laws to improve the life of the proletariat, living and working conditions were awful and horrendous in this period. In St. Petersburg, there are vast cholera outbreaks, but generally life and working conditions really resembles probably what you'd expect to see at the start of early 19th century Britain in terms of industrial growth. It was hard, it was grim. Life also remains really tough for the peasants. Although some kulaks, richer peasants, do emerge, life is still really difficult. And understandably, that difficulty in both the cities and the countryside leads to discontent. There are more strikes, there are more riots. And the Tsarist regime reacts to those riots and those strikes with immense repression. The most famous example being in 1912, when 500 strikers were killed during the Lena Goldfields massacre. So things already by 1914 are grim. And then they really make a turn for the worse. And they make a turn for the worse as Russia, like most of the other countries in Europe, joins the First World War. And the First World War is an unmitigated disaster for the Russian Empire. It begins incredibly badly at the Battle of Tannenberg, where even in that first battle that they face in the First World War, 300,000 people are left dead. By the end of the war, Russia has 8 million casualties. A huge, vast amount of the population really affected by this key event. And really significantly, the government does very little to help the people at home. And the people at home who are really struggling socioeconomically, the government doesn't help them. The Zemstva, though, the local parliaments, step in. And the Zemstva now provide medical facilities and other services. So the Zemstva politics, local politics, is helping them where the Tsarist government is ignoring them. And already by 1915, you see some politicians turning against Nicholas, where the Duma deputies established a progressive bloc and for the first time start asking and calling for a constitutional monarchy. Not Nicholas to be got rid of entirely, not a revolution, but a more constitutional monarchy where power is taken away from him. And in September of 1915, Nicholas takes a gamble, and after a series of further defeats, he takes charge of the whole war and becomes commander-in-chief on the front line. That gamble would have paid off if Russia had been successful, but it was not, and it makes Nicholas look weaker and more ridiculous to the people back home. And this is made significantly worse as Nicholas being on the front lines as commander-in-chief means he leaves behind Alexandra, his German wife, and this man, Rasputin, a mystic priest. And this was problematic. And it was problematic because it looked like Nicholas was not in control. And he wasn't. And as a result of that lack of control, the economy continues to strain. Goods and supplies struggle to reach the cities. So those living conditions, which people were horrific before the war, get worse. There is a 300% rise in living costs during the war, and things get worse and worse and worse. And so by the end of 1916, resentment is growing. Rasputin himself is murdered because some of the nobles are so angry that he has arguably taken over power, and protests begin on the streets, which will only become bigger as we enter into 1917. So let's take a pause at the end of 1916 and again look back on the legacy of Nicholas II. Nicholas starts this period in 1906 in a difficult position. He's just managed to survive a revolution. But arguably, his mishandling of a crisis gets worse as you reach through these 10 years. The things that look positive in this period, like the economy, actually only really put more strain on the Russian people. And Nicholas looks like a man who is out of touch and really has no control over what is happening. 1917 is ready to happen. It's all been building. Let's see what happens next.